The workshop smelled of cedar and thyme, a scent that clung to Jacob Ellis like a memory he couldn't shake. At 35, he stood in the heart of his grandfather's sanctuary in Willow Creek, a small town nestled in the American Midwest, where the past lingered like dust motes in the slanted sunlight. The workbench, scarred from decades of Edward Ellis's carpentry, stretched before him, cluttered with chisels, a half-finished birdhouse, and memories of summers spent learning to carve. But it was the locked toolbox, oak, iron-clasped, and stubbornly silent, that drew Jacob's gaze. Grandpa's toolbox was his sanctuary, he thought, the words forming a quiet mantra. But why was it always locked, even from me? Edward Ellis had been a man of few words. A World War II veteran whose hands spoke through wood. He taught Jacob to measure twice, to feel the grain of oak, to respect the craft. But the toolbox, a relic as old as Jacob's earliest memories, was forbidden. "Some things stay private, son," Edward would say, his voice gruff but kind, his blue eyes flicking to the box as if it held more than tools. Jacob, a mechanical engineer with a mind for precision, had never questioned it as a boy. Now, 2 weeks after Edward's funeral, the question burned. What was so sacred, or so secret, that it stayed locked even from him? The Willow Creek house, a 2-story clapboard with peeling paint, felt hollow without Edward's whistle or the rhythmic tap of his hammer. Margaret, Jacob's grandmother, had moved to a nearby assisted living home a year ago, her memory fading like the photographs on the mantel. Jacob had come to sort through the house, to decide what to keep, sell, or let go. The workshop, tucked behind the garage, was his last stop. A place he'd avoided until grief pushed him through the creaking door. The air was cool, the October light filtering through cracked windows, casting shadows that danced across the floorboards. Every corner held a memory: the stool where Jacob sat at 10, watching Edward shape a cedar plank, the radio that played Glenn Miller tunes, the smell of linseed oil that clung to his grandfather's flannel shirts. Jacob ran a hand over the toolbox, its surface smooth from years of touch. It was heavier than it looked, as if it carried the weight of Edward's life. He'd always imagined it held rare tools, maybe a set of antique chisels or a custom plane Edward prized. But the lock, a sturdy brass mechanism, suggested something more. Jacob's fingers traced the iron clasps, his heart thudding with a mix of curiosity and guilt. Was he betraying Edward by standing here, tempted to pry open his secrets? The man had been his hero, the one who'd shown him how to build, how to fix, how to keep going when life felt unsteady. Yet the toolbox loomed like a question mark, challenging everything Jacob thought he knew. He knelt, his jeans catching on the rough floor, and scanned the workshop for answers. The shelves held jars of screws, a rusted coffee can, and a stack of popular mechanics magazines from the 1960s. Nothing explained the lock. Then, under a loose floorboard near the workbench, Jacob's fingers brushed something cold. He pried the board up, revealing a small, rusted key, its teeth worn but deliberate, as if hidden with purpose. His breath caught. Edward had always been meticulous. Nothing was accidental. This key was meant to be found. But by whom? Jacob's hands trembled as he fitted the key into the lock. The mechanism resisted, then gave with a soft click that echoed in the silent workshop. The lid creaked open, the hinges groaning like a confession. Jacob expected tools, shiny, worn, or rare, but the box was nearly empty. A velvet cloth, faded to gray, lay folded inside. He lifted it, and there, nestled in its folds, was a silver wedding ring, thin and worn, its surface scratched from years of existence. Jacob held it to the light, squinting at the engraving inside. Siani forever. His stomach dropped. His grandmother's ring was gold, engraved with many. For Margaret and Edward. Who was C? The question hit like a betrayal, sharp and disorienting. He turned the ring over, its weight light but heavy with implication. Edward and Margaret had been married for 60 years, their love a quiet constant in Jacob's life. Margaret's ring, still on her finger in the nursing home, was unmistakable. This silver band, with its unfamiliar initial, belonged to someone else, a woman Edward had never mentioned. Jacob's mind raced. Edward's wartime stories were sparse: battles in Europe, a purple heart burned in a muddy trench, but never a word about people, let alone a woman. Had he loved someone before Margaret? Had he hidden a life, a promise, behind this lock? The workshop felt smaller now, the air thicker. Jacob pocketed the ring, its cool metal pressing against his thigh. He closed the toolbox. But the lock no longer felt like protection, it felt like a cage. Outside, wind chimes tinkled, a sound that had always meant home but now carried an edge of unease. Jacob's life was built on logic. Gears, blueprints, equations. But this ring defied reason. It whispered of a past Edward had buried, a story Jacob didn't know but couldn't ignore. He thought of his grandfather's hands. Calloused and steady, shaping wood with care. Those hands had held this ring, had locked it away. Why? Jacob stood, the key still in his palm, and looked around the workshop. The birdhouse Edward had been working on sat unfinished, a reminder of time cut short. Jacob's grief, raw and unprocessed, mingled with curiosity. He'd come to Willow Creek to close a chapter, to pack up the house and move on. But the ring changed everything. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a door to a part of Edward's life Jacob had never touched. A life tied to to a promise etched in silver, to a secret that had stayed locked until now. He stepped outside, the autumn air sharp against his skin. The town stretched before him, quiet and familiar. Its main street lined with mom-and-pop shops and a diner that still served cherry pie like it was 1955. Willow Creek was Edward's world, the place he'd returned to after the war, where he'd built a life with Margaret. But the ring suggested another world, one Edward had left behind, or one that had left him. Jacob's engineer brain demanded answers. Who was C? Why had Edward kept the ring? And why hide the key, as if he wanted someone, maybe Jacob, to find it? The ring burned in his pocket, a question he couldn't unask. Jacob knew this was no ending, but a beginning. He was no detective, no historian, but he was Edward's grandson, the boy who'd learned to carve at this workbench. If there was a story behind this ring, he'd find it, not just for himself, but for the man who'd shaped him, the man whose secrets were now his to unravel. The workshop door clicked shut behind him, but the mystery followed, as persistent as the wind chimes' song. Jacob Ellis sat at his kitchen table, the silver ring glinting under the fluorescent light like a question he couldn't answer. The small apartment in Willow Creek, with its cluttered blueprints and coffee-stained mugs, felt too small for the weight of what he'd found. The ring engraved, "Siani forever," wasn't his grandmother Margaret's. It belonged to someone else, someone Edward, his grandfather, had never mentioned. Jacob, a mechanical engineer who thrived on solving problems with calipers and calculations, was stumped. This wasn't a gear out of alignment, or a bolt to tighten. This was a piece of his grandfather's heart, locked away in a toolbox for decades, now resting in his palm. The night after opening the toolbox, Jacob barely slept. Edward's workshop, just a mile away in the old family house, haunted him. He saw his grandfather's hands, callous from years of carpentry, closing the oak box with a finality that excluded even Jacob, the grandson he'd raised like a son. Edward's death 2 weeks ago had left a void, but the ring widened it, turning grief into something sharper, doubt. Had Jacob ever truly known the man who taught him to carve, to persevere, to build? The question gnawed, and by morning, Jacob knew he couldn't let it rest. He needed answers, not just for himself, but for the legacy Edward had left behind. He started with what he had, the ring and the key, both now on the table beside a cooling cup of coffee. Jacob's apartment, a bachelor's haven of organized chaos, reflected his practical nature. Shelves held engineering manuals, a model bridge he'd built for a client, and a single photo of him and Edward. Taken 5 years ago. In it, Edward's smile was slight, his blue eyes distant, as if guarding something even then. Jacob studied the photo, searching for clues. Edward had been a World War II veteran. A carpenter who'd turned scraps of wood into art, a husband to Margaret for 60 years. But who was C? A friend? A lover? The word felt foreign. A betrayal of the grandparents whose love had anchored Jacob's childhood. He moved to the living room, where a cardboard box held Edward's belongings, sent from the house after the funeral. Jacob hadn't touched it yet, the task too raw. Now he knelt beside it, the ring in his pocket pressing against his thigh. The box smelled of dust and old paper, a time capsule of Edward's life. Inside were faded photos, a Purple Heart medal in its velvet case, and a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed. Jacob's pulse quickened. Edward had never been one for words. But maybe he'd left something here, a hint, a name. The photos showed Edward young, in a soldier's uniform, his face boyish but hardened. One image caught Jacob's eye, Edward standing by a jeep. A field hospital tent in the background, his arm around a nurse. The nurse's face was blurred, the photo creased, but her smile was clear, warm, alive. Jacob turned it over, hoping for a name. But found only a date. June 1943. His grandfather had rarely spoken of the war, deflecting questions with a shrug or a story about fixing a tank under fire. Had this nurse been C? Jacob set the photo aside, his engineer's mind piecing together fragments like a blueprint. The journal was heavier, its spine cracked. Jacob flipped through it, expecting carpentry notes or tool inventories, but found something else, a single page, written in Edward's tight script, dated 1945. To Clara, it began. I promise I'd wait forever, and I will. If you're out there, forgive me for not finding you. Jacob's breath caught. Clara. The C. On the ring. The words were raw, unfinished, as if Edward had stopped mid-thought. There was no address. No envelope, just a plea to someone lost. Jacob read it again, the name sinking in. Clara wasn't Margaret. She was a ghost from Edward's past, a woman tied to a promise Jacob didn't understand. He leaned back, the journal open on his lap. The apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Jacob's life had been orderly, his days filled with deadlines and designs. But this discovery disrupted everything. He felt a pang of loyalty to Margaret, still alive at 80, her memory fading in a nursing home. Had she known about Clara? Had Edward loved another woman before her, or, worse, during their marriage? The thought was unthinkable, yet the ring and the letter were real, undeniable. Jacob needed more. He grabbed his laptop, the ring now a talisman in his hand, and searched for Clara and Willow Creek alongside. World War II. The results were sparse, but one hit stood out. A digitized article from the Willow Creek Gazette, dated 1946, titled, Local Nurse Missing After European Campaign. The article described Clara Hensley, a 22-year-old nurse who'd served in a field hospital in France, vanished after a bombing in 1944. A grainy photo showed a young woman in a nurse's cap, her eyes kind but resolute, her smile familiar. Jacob's heart skipped. It was the nurse from Edward's photo, her face clearer now, her presence undeniable. The article offered little else. Clara's family had waited for news, but none came. She was presumed dead, a casualty of war. Jacob stared at the screen, the ring heavy in his palm. Clara Hensley? Had she been Edward's love? Had he carried her memory, locked in that toolbox, through 60 years with Margaret? The questions multiplied, each one a thread pulling Jacob deeper into a past he hadn't asked to uncover. He felt a mix of curiosity and dread. The engineer in him craving resolution, the grandson fearing what he'd find. He drove to the Willow Creek Library, a brick building that hadn't changed since his childhood. The librarian, Mrs. Carter, A spry woman in her 70s greeted him warmly. "Sorting through Edward's things?" she asked, her eyes soft with sympathy. Jacob nodded, hesitant to share the ring's secret. "I'm looking for records from the 1940s, he said. "Anything on local nurses, maybe someone named Clara Hensley." Mrs. Carter's brow furrowed, but she led him to the microfilm reader, pulling reels of old newspapers and town records. As the machine hummed, Jacob scanned articles, his eyes catching on headlines about rationing, victory gardens, and soldiers returning home. Then, another piece on Clara, a memorial notice from 1947, mentioning her parents and a surviving sister, Ellen Hensley. The notice listed an address in nearby Oakville. Jacob jotted it down, his mind racing. If Clara's family was still around, they might know more about her, about Edward, about the ring. But the address was old, the family likely gone. Still, it was a lead, a thread to follow. Mrs. Carter lingered, watching him. "Clara Hensley was a town hero," she said. "Folks said she saved dozens of soldiers before she disappeared." "Your granddad might have known her, they were about the same age." Jacob's throat tightened. He thanked her, pocketing the note, and stepped outside. The autumn air was crisp, the town square quiet except for the rustle of leaves. Willow Creek felt smaller now, its history pressing in. Jacob's life had been about moving forward, new projects, new plans. But the ring pulled him backward, into a story he wasn't sure he wanted to tell. He stood by his truck, the ring in his pocket, the journal in his hand. Edward's words echoed. "Forgive me for not finding you." Jacob's loyalty to his grandfather clashed with his need to know. What if Clara was a mistake, a regret Edward had buried? What if she was more, a love that shaped him, a loss he never shared? Jacob's fingers traced the journal's edge, his engineer's logic faltering. This wasn't a problem to solve. It was a life to understand. He thought of Margaret, her gentle smile, her stories of dancing with Edward at the VFW hall. Did she deserve to know? Did Jacob have the right to dig? The ring was a weight, a promise, a secret. Jacob knew he couldn't stop now. Clara Hensley, whoever she was, had been part of Edward's story, and that story was part of Jacob's too. He'd find her family, her truth, even if it changed how he saw the man he'd loved. The library's clock chimed noon, and Jacob drove home, the road stretching like the path ahead, uncertain, but unavoidable. Jacob Ellis clutched the silver ring in his pocket as he drove the winding road to Oakville, a neighboring town 20 miles from Willow Creek. The address from the 1947 memorial notice for Clara Hensley was a long shot, decades old, likely leading to a dead end, but it was all he had. The ring engraved, "Siani forever." And the journal entry to Clara had appended his understanding of his grandfather, Edward Ellis. Edward, the stoic carpenter and World War II veteran who'd raised him, had loved someone before Margaret. His grandmother. Or perhaps during, a thought Jacob pushed away, unwilling to tarnish the man he'd idolized. The autumn leaves swirled across the highway, red and gold against the gray sky, mirroring the churn of his emotions. He wasn't just chasing a name, he was chasing Edward's heart. The address led to a small flower shop, Hensley's Blooms, its sign faded but cheerful, surrounded by pots of chrysanthemums and marigolds. Jacob parked his truck, the ring now in a velvet pouch alongside Edward's journal, both tucked into his jacket. The shop's bell jingled as he entered, and the air filled with the sweet scent of roses and damp earth. A woman, about 50, stood behind the counter, arranging lilies in a vase. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled into a loose bun, and her eyes, warm but guarded, met his. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying the soft drawl of someone born in these parts. Jacob hesitated, suddenly aware of how strange his mission sounded. "I'm looking for someone connected to Clara Hensley," he said, clearing his throat. "I found her name in some old records. I think she knew my grandfather, Edward Ellis." The woman's hand stilled, the lilies forgotten. Her gaze sharpened, and for a moment the shop seemed to hold its breath. Clara was my aunt, she said finally, her voice softer now, tinged with something Jacob couldn't place, grief, perhaps, or recognition. I'm Lila Hensley. Why are you here? He pulled the velvet pouch from his jacket, his fingers unsteady as he opened it. The silver ring caught the shop's warm light, its scratches gleaming like battle scars. I found this in my grandfather's toolbox, Jacob said, setting it on the counter. It's engraved Siani forever. I think it's Clara's. Lila's breath hitched, and she reached for the ring, her hands trembling. She turned it over, tracing the engraving with a fingertip, and her eyes filled with tears. Oh, Clara, she whispered, as if speaking to someone in the room. Jacob's chest tightened. He'd expected answers. Not this raw emotion, and it pulled him deeper into the mystery. Lila set the ring down gently, wiping her eyes. You'd better sit, she said, gesturing to a wooden stool by the counter. Jacob complied, the journal heavy in his jacket. Lila took a deep breath, her voice steadying. Clara was my father's older sister. She was a nurse in the war, stationed in France. She and your grandfather, they were in love. The word landed like a stone, heavy and real. Jacob leaned forward, his engineer's logic giving way to the pull of a story he hadn't asked to hear. They met in 43, Lila continued, at a field hospital. Edward was wounded, and Clara nursed him back to health. They fell hard, the kind of love that burns through fear. They planned to marry when the war ended. Jacob's mind flashed to the blurred photo from Edward's box, the nurse, smiling beside a jeep, her arm around a young Edward. Clara. Lila's eyes drifted to the ring, and she continued, her voice soft but clear. They made these rings, Clara and Edward. Not fancy, just silver bands they traded as a promise. Siani forever, they said. But then the hospital was bombed in 44. Clara vanished. Edward searched, but the war swallowed her. He never knew if she lived or died. Lila paused, her fingers brushing the ring again. He went home, built a life. But he never forgot her. Jacob's throat tightened. He saw Edward in his workshop, locking the toolbox, his face etched with a sorrow Jacob had never understood. There's more, he said, pulling the journal from his jacket. He opened it to the page dated 1945, the plea to Clara. I promise I'd wait forever, and I will. Lila read it silently, tears spilling down her cheeks. He meant it, she said, her voice breaking. He carried her all those years. Jacob felt a pang, for Edward, for Clara, for the life they'd lost. But another question burned, what about Margaret? Had Edward's love for Clara shadowed his marriage? Lila stood, moving to a shelf behind the counter. She returned with a small wooden box, its lid carved with a delicate rose. Clara left this, she said, opening it. Inside was another silver ring, identical to Edward's, engraved. Siani forever. Jacob's breath caught. The rings, separated for decades, now lay side by side, their promises intact. Lila pulled out a bundle of letters, tied with twine. These are Clara's, she said. She wrote to Edward but never sent them. My father kept them after we lost her. Jacob's heart raced. The letters were a bridge to Clara, to the truth, but he hesitated. Reading them felt like stepping into Edward's soul. Lila's voice softened, as if sensing his conflict. Clara loved Edward with everything she had. She wrote about him like he was the sun, her light in the dark of war. But when she disappeared, it broke them both. Jacob nodded, his mind spinning. He saw Clara in his imagination, bandaging wounds under flickering lamps, her smile steady despite the chaos. He saw Edward young and desperate, calling her name in the rubble. The image was vivid, too real, and it stirred something deep, an ache for a love that hadn't survived, but hadn't died either. The shop's bell jingled as a customer entered, but Lila waved them off with a polite smile, her focus on Jacob. "Why now?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "Why dig this up after all these years?" Jacob swallowed, the ring's weight grounding him. "Edward was my hero," he said. "He raised me when my dad wasn't around. I thought I knew him. But this ring, it's like he's asking me to find her. To finish something he couldn't." Lila nodded, her expression softening. "Then you should know the whole story," she said. "But it's not easy. Clara's life didn't end with that bombing. And neither did her love for Edward." Jacob's pulse quickened. "She survived?" he asked, the words barely a whisper. Lila's silence was answer enough. Her eyes holding a truth she wasn't ready to share. She handed him the bundle of letters. "Start here," she said. "They'll tell you who she was. Then come back, and I'll tell you the rest." Jacob took the letters, their paper brittle under his fingers, each one a piece of Clara's heart. He thanked Lila, his voice thick, and stepped back into the autumn air. The ring and letters now companions in his quest. The drive home was quiet, the letters on the passenger seat like a passenger themselves. Jacob's mind replayed Lila's words. They fell hard. The kind of love that burns through fear. He thought of Edward, locking the toolbox, carrying Clara's ring through 60 years with Margaret. Had it been guilt? Loyalty? Love? Jacob's loyalty to his grandparents clashed with his need to understand. The ring wasn't just a relic, it was a promise, a wound, a story begging to be told. He pulled into his driveway. The Willow Creek stars emerging above, and knew he was no longer just Edward's grandson. He was the keeper of a love story that had waited decades to be heard. Jacob Ellis sat on his couch. The bundle of Clara Hensley's letters spread across the coffee table like fragments of a life he'd never known. The silver ring engraved, "Siani forever," rested beside them. Its twin now in Lila Hensley's flower shop, a mirror of the promise his grandfather Edward had made. After meeting Lila, Jacob's world felt unsteady. As if the grandfather he'd revered, a quiet carpenter, a war veteran, a devoted husband to Margaret, had been someone else entirely. Lila's words echoed. They fell hard. The kind of love that burns through fear. The letters, brittle and yellowed, were Clara's voice, her heart, and Jacob knew they held the truth about her and Edward. He hesitated. The engineer in him craving order, the grandson fearing chaos. But the ring demanded he read, demanded he understand. He untied the twine, the paper crinkling under his fingers, and opened the first letter, dated June 1943. Clara's handwriting was neat, her words vivid, pulling Jacob back to a world of war and hope. The scene dissolved. And he was no longer in his Willow Creek apartment, but in a field hospital in France, 1943, where the air smelled of antiseptic and blood, and the ground trembled with distant artillery. Edward Ellis, 22, lay on a cot, his leg bandaged, his face pale from a shrapnel wound. The hospital, a cluster of canvas tents, buzzed with urgency, nurses rushing, soldiers groaning, lanterns flickering against the night. Edward's blue eyes, sharp despite the pain, followed a young nurse as she moved from cot to cot. Clara Hensley, 21, her auburn hair tucked under a cap, her hand steady as she checked a soldier's pulse. She was slight but commanding, her voice a calm anchor in the chaos. "You're going to be fine," she told Edward, her smile brief but warm, like sunlight breaking through clouds. He managed a nod, his throat too dry to speak, but her presence steadied him. Clara returned the next day, and the next, her visits a rhythm Edward clung to. She changed his bandages with care, her fingers brushing his skin, sparking something neither could name. "You're from Willow Creek?" she asked, noticing his chart. "I grew up in Oakville, not far." The coincidence felt like fate, and they talked, first of home, then of dreams. Clara wanted to teach after the war, to fill classrooms with poetry. Edward an engineer before the draft, dreamed of building homes, not tanks. Their conversations, stolen between her rounds, were lifelines. Under a lantern's glow, Clara read him Robert Frost, her voice soft. Two roads diverged in a wood and Edward finished. I took the one less traveled by. They laughed, the sound of rebellion against the war outside. By July, Edward was healing. But he lingered in the hospital, volunteering to fix stretchers or mend tents, anything to stay near Clara. One night, under a sky heavy with stars, they slipped outside the camp. Sitting beneath an oak tree. The air was warm, crickets chirping, the war a distant rumble. Clara leaned against the trunk, her nurse's cap off, her hair catching the moonlight. What do you want most? She asked. Edward looked at her, his heart pounding. You, he said, the word raw, honest. She blushed but didn't look away. Then we'll have to survive this, she said, her voice fierce. They carved their initials. CNE. Into the tree, a quiet vow. They made rings that week, not with gold but with silver wire Edward scavenged from a broken radio. He twisted the metal with pliers, his hands steady despite the ache in his leg. Clara watched, her eyes bright. They're not much, he said, sliding one onto her finger. She slipped the other onto his, her touch electric. They're everything, she whispered. They kissed under the oak, the world shrinking to just them, the ring sealing a promise. CNE forever. The war could take their plans, their safety, but not this. The letters shifted, Clara's tone growing urgent by October 1943. She wrote of bombings creeping closer, of soldiers she couldn't save. I hold on to you, Edward, she wrote, even when the ground shakes. Jacob's heart ached as he read, imagining Clara's courage, her fear. The next letter, dated January 1944, was shorter, frantic. They're moving the hospital. I don't know where you are. Find me, please. Jacob's fingers tightened on the paper. He knew what came next, what Lila had told him. The bombing. The loss. The scene returned, vivid and brutal. February 1944, the hospital under siege. Explosions lit the night, tents collapsing, screams piercing the air. Clara ran between cots, pulling soldiers to safety, her cap lost, her face streaked with soot. Edward, reassigned to a nearby unit, heard the attack and sprinted through the chaos. His legs still weak but his heart driving him. Clara! He shouted, dodging debris, the air thick with smoke. He reached the hospital as a final blast tore through, the ground erupting. Tents burned. Bodies lay still, and Clara was gone. Edward clawed through rubble, his hands bleeding, calling her name until his voice broke. Dawn came, gray and silent, but Clara didn't. Jacob's eyes burned as the flashback faded, the letters trembling in his hands. Clara's final note, undated, was a single line. If I'm lost, know I loved you. Edward had searched, Lila said, scouring camps, writing to aid stations, but the war offered no answers. He returned to Willow Creek in 1945, the silver ring in his pocket, his heart a wound he couldn't close. He locked it in the toolbox, a tomb for a love he couldn't bury. Jacob saw him now, not as the grandfather who'd carved birdhouses, but as a young man broken by loss, carrying Clara through decades. The apartment was dark, the clock ticking past midnight. Jacob set the letters down, his chest heavy. He thought of Edward's workshop, the toolbox a silent guardian of this story. Clara's courage. Her love, her disappearance, they were real, not just words on paper. Jacob felt their weight, their pain, as if he'd lived it. He thought of Margaret, Edward's wife. Her gentle smile in the nursing home. Had she known? Had Edward's love for Clara dimmed his love for her? The questions hurt, but the letters hurt more. Clara's voice, so alive, now silent. Jacob stood, pacing, the ring in his hand. Lila's words rang. Clara's life didn't end with that bombing. What did that mean? Had she survived, only to lose Edward? The possibility was a new ache. A new hope. Jacob's engineer brain wanted a tidy resolution, but his heart, stirred by Clara's words, wanted truth. He saw Edward locking the toolbox, his face etched with grief, and understood. This wasn't just a secret. It was a love that had shaped him, that had made him the man who'd raised Jacob. The letters were a bridge, and Jacob would cross it, for Edward, for Clara. For the promise they'd carved under an oak. Jacob Ellis drove through the quiet streets of Oakville, the bundle of Clara Hensley's letters on the seat beside him. Their words still echoing from the night before. The silver ring engraved, "Siani forever," weighed heavy in his pocket, a twin to the one Lila Hensley had shown him in her flower shop. Clara's love for his grandfather Edward, so vivid in her wartime letters, had ended in tragedy, or so Jacob thought. Lila's cryptic words, "Clara's life didn't end with that bombing," hung like a promise and a challenge. Today, Lila had asked him to meet her at a place that would answer his questions, a small cemetery on the edge of town. Jacob's heart raced, torn between hope and dread. What truth awaited? And what would it mean for Edward, for Margaret, for the family Jacob thought he knew? The cemetery was tucked behind a grove of maples, their leaves a fiery red against the October sky. Lila stood by a simple headstone, her silver hair catching the breeze. She wore a wool coat, her hands clasped, her face solemn but kind. Jacob parked his truck and approached, the ring and letters in his jacket, their presence grounding him. "This is Clara's place," Lila said, her voice soft, as she gestured to the headstone. The inscription read, "Clara Hensley, 1922 to 1975, beloved daughter and sister." Jacob's breath caught. 1975. Clara had lived 30 years beyond the 1944 bombing that Edward believed had taken her. The realization was a jolt, a twist that reframed everything. Lila knelt, brushing leaves from the grave. "She survived," she said, her eyes meeting Jacob's. "The bombing left her wounded." Her memory fractured. She was evacuated to a hospital in England, listed as a Jane Doe for months. By the time she remembered who she was, Edward was gone, back to America. The war had scattered everyone. Jacob's mind reeled. He saw Edward in his workshop, locking the toolbox, clinging to Clara's ring, never knowing she'd lived. "Why didn't she find him?" he asked. His voice tight. Lila's gaze softened, but her words were steady. "Clara was broken, Jacob. Not just her body, her spirit. She'd lost so much. When she learned Edward had returned to Willow Creek, she couldn't face him. She thought he moved on, that she'd be a burden. So she stayed silent." Jacob stared at the headstone, Clara's name etched in stone, her silence louder than the war. Lila continued, her voice heavy with her aunt's story. "Clara came back to Oakville in '46, lived quietly with my grandparents. She taught school, like she dreamed, but she never married. She wore her ring, the one Edward made, until the day she died. She loved him always, but she let him go, for his sake." Jacob's chest ached. Clara's sacrifice was a mirror to Edward's. Two hearts carrying the same promise, separated by a choice neither fully understood. He thought of Edward's journal. "Forgive me for not finding you." Had Clara forgiven herself for not trying? Lila handed Jacob a small notebook from her coat, its pages worn. "Clara's diary," she said. "She wrote about Edward until the end. Read it later. It'll show you who she was." Jacob took it, his fingers brushing the leather, feeling the weight of another life. He wanted to ask more, but the truth was enough for now. Clara had lived, loved, and chosen silence, leaving Edward to build a life with Margaret, unaware. The ring in Jacob's pocket felt heavier, not just a promise but a wound that had never healed. He drove back to Willow Creek, the diary and letters beside him, his mind a storm of emotions. Clara's survival was a gift and a tragedy, a secret that changed Edward's story. But what about Margaret? Jacob's grandmother. Now 80, lived in a nursing home, her memory fading but her love for Edward unshaken. Had she sensed his hidden grief? Could Jacob tell her about Clara without breaking her heart? The thought was unbearable, yet keeping the secret felt like betraying Edward's memory. Jacob's engineer's logic faltered. This wasn't a problem to solve but a truth to face. He parked outside the Willow Creek Care Center, its brick facade softened by autumn vines. Margaret's room was on the second floor, a cozy space filled with photos and quilts. She sat by the window, her white hair glowing in the sunlight, her hands folded over a gold ring, her wedding band. Many. Jacob kissed her cheek, his heart pounding. "Hey, Grandma," he said, sitting beside her. Margaret's eyes, still sharp despite her memory lapses, lit up. "Jacob, you look like your grandpa today," she said, her voice warm. The comparison stung, knowing what he carried. He took a breath. The ring in his pocket a silent urging. "Grandma, I found something in Grandpa's workshop," he began, his voice unsteady. He told her about the toolbox, the key, the silver ring with Siani forever. He spoke of Clara, the nurse Edward loved in the war, the bombing, and Lila's revelation that Clara had survived. Jacob watched Margaret's face, bracing for pain, but her expression was calm. Her eyes distant yet clear. When he finished, silence hung between them, broken only by the tick of a wall clock. Margaret reached for his hand, her grip frail but firm. "I knew Edward carried something," she said, her voice steady. "Not a woman, not like that, but a sorrow he never named. His eyes would drift sometimes, like he was seeing someone far away. I loved him enough to let it be." Jacob's throat tightened. "You're not angry?" he asked. Margaret smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Angry? No, Jacob. Edward gave me 60 years, a home, you. If he loved her first, she made him the man I married. I'm grateful for that." Jacob's eyes burned. Margaret's forgiveness was a grace he hadn't expected, a strength that humbled him. "What do I do with this?" he asked, holding the ring. Margaret looked at it, her smile soft. "Honor them," she said. "Clara and Edward. Their love wasn't wrong, it was just caught in a war. Tell their story, so it's not locked away anymore." Jacob nodded, tears falling now. Margaret's words were a turning point, a call to action. The ring wasn't a secret to hide but a legacy to share. He left the nursing home as dusk settled, the Willow Creek sky streaked with pink. Clara's diary sat unopened in his truck, but Margaret's blessing gave him courage to face it. Edward's love for Clara hadn't diminished his life with Margaret, it had shaped it, made him the man who'd built a family, a workshop, a grandson's world. Jacob's quest, once driven by doubt, now felt like a duty, to give Clara and Edward the ending they'd been denied. He thought of Lila, of the cemetery, of two rings that had waited decades to be reunited. The truth was out. And it wasn't a betrayal, it was a bridge. Jacob drove home, the ring in his pocket no longer a burden but a beacon. He'd read Clara's diary, returned to Lila, and find a way to honor a love that had survived war, silence, and time. Edward's toolbox, once a mystery, was now a doorway, and Jacob was ready to step through, for his grandfather, for Clara, for the family that held them both. Jacob Ellis stood in his grandfather's workshop, the oak toolbox now open on the workbench, its secrets laid bare. The silver ring engraved, "Siani forever," gleamed beside Clara Hensley's diary and letters, each a testament to a love that had survived war but not time. After Lila's revelation that Clara lived until 1975, and Margaret's urging to honor their story, Jacob felt a shift. The ring was no longer a mystery to unravel but a legacy to preserve. Edward and Clara's love, though torn apart by a bombing in 1944, deserved more than a locked box. Jacob, the engineer who once saw life in blueprints, now saw it in stories, and he knew what he had to do. Transform Edward's workshop into a space that would keep their love alive. The idea came to him the night after visiting Margaret, as he sat with Clara's diary under the glow of his apartment's lamp. Her final entries, written in the 1970s, spoke of Edward not with bitterness but with gratitude. "You made me brave, even when I let you go." Jacob's throat tightened. Clara had chosen silence to protect Edward, just as Edward had locked the ring away to protect his life with Margaret. Their sacrifice deserved a tribute, not just for them but for Willow Creek, a town that had carried their story in its quiet streets. He called Lila the next morning, his voice steady with purpose. "I want to turn the workshop into a community space," he said. "A place to tell Edward and Clara's story, to show their rings, their letters. Will you help me?" Lila agreed, her voice warm over the phone. "Clara would have loved that," she said. "Let's do it right." They met at the workshop, its dusty shelves and worn floorboards a canvas for something new. The space was small, barely 20 by 30 feet, but it held Edward's spirit, the scent of cedar, the echo of his hammer. Jacob envisioned a display at the center, a case for the rings, Clara's letters, and Edward's carvings, surrounded by benches for visitors. Lila suggested adding a wall for local history, where townsfolk could share their own wartime stories. "It's not just about them," she said, her eyes bright. "It's about all of us." They worked through November, Jacob's engineering skills turning vision into reality. He sanded the floors, painted the walls a soft cream, and installed skylights to let in the winter sun. Lila brought photos from her family's collection, Clara in her nurse's uniform, Edward by a jeep, their smiles a window to 1943. Jacob crafted a display case from oak, its edges smooth, its glass clear. He carved "Siani Forever" into the base, a nod to the rings that would rest inside. Lila hung curtains, their floral pattern echoing her shop, and added a guest book for visitors to leave their thoughts. The workshop, once a private refuge, began to feel like a sanctuary for the town. As they worked, Jacob read Clara's diary, its pages a guide. She wrote of small joys, teaching children to read, planting roses, and of Edward, a constant presence. "I see you in every soldier who comes home." Her words fueled Jacob's resolve. He thought of Edward, locking the toolbox, his grief a silent companion. This project was his way of unlocking that grief, of giving Edward and Clara the reunion they'd been denied. Lila shared stories too, her voice softening as she recalled her aunt. "Clara was quiet, but her laugh could fill a room. She'd have liked you, Jacob." He smiled, feeling a kinship with Clara, a woman he'd never met but now carried in his heart. The project wasn't without challenges. The town council questioned the workshop's new purpose, citing zoning rules. But Jacob's quiet determination, and Lila's charm, won them over. Local veterans offered to help, bringing tools and stories of their own. One, an 80-year-old named Tom, remembered Clara from Oakville. "She patched me up in '44, he said, his eyes misty. "Never knew what happened to her." Jacob listened, realizing the workshop was already weaving lives together. Just as he'd hoped. The opening was set for December, a month before Willow Creek's annual winter fair. Jacob and Lila invited the town, posting flyers at the diner, the library, and the VFW hall. Jacob felt a flicker of nerves. What if no one came? What if Edward and Clara's story didn't matter to anyone else? But Margaret's words echoed. "Honor them." He pushed forward, polishing the display case, framing Clara's letters, and placing Edward's purple heart beside them. Lila brought Clara's ring, and they set both bands on velvet, their silver catching the light like stars. The night before the opening, Jacob found something else in the toolbox, tucked beneath a false bottom, a single letter, written in Edward's hand. Dated a year before his death. It was addressed to Clara, though he'd never sent it. "You taught me love," it read, "and I carried it every day, even when I couldn't carry you. I hope you found peace, wherever you are." Jacob's eyes burned. Edward had written it at 90, his hand shaky but his heart clear. The letter was a final piece, A confession that belonged in the workshop. A voice for the man Jacob loved. The opening day dawned cold, the workshop glowing with string lights Lila had hung. Townsfolk arrived, veterans in VFW caps, families with children, Mrs. Carter from the library. Margaret came, wheeled in by a nurse, her smile radiant. Jacob stood by the display, the rings at its heart, and welcomed the crowd. "This is for my grandfather, Edward Ellis," he said, his voice steady. "And Clara Hensley, the woman he loved in a war that tried to take everything. Their story is ours, too." He read Edward's final letter, his voice breaking as he reached. "I hope you found peace." The room was silent, then filled with soft sobs, hands reaching for tissues, veterans nodding in shared understanding. Lila spoke next, her voice warm. Sharing Clara's courage as a nurse, her quiet life after the war. She pointed to the rings, their engravings of promise unbroken. "They loved across time," she said. "And now we're here to keep that love alive." The crowd murmured, some stepping forward to share their own stories. A lost brother, a wartime sweetheart, a letter never sent. Tom, the veteran, left a note in the guestbook. "For Clara, who saved me." Jacob watched, his heart full. The workshop was no longer just Edward's, it was Willow Creek's, a place where love and loss could breathe. Margaret took Jacob's hand, her eyes bright. "You did good, son," she whispered. "Edward's proud." Jacob squeezed her hand, tears falling. He thought of Clara's diary, Edward's letter. The rings that had waited decades to be seen. The workshop, once a tomb for grief, was now a beacon, its light reaching beyond the town. Jacob felt changed. Not just as Edward's grandson, but as a man who'd learned what love could endure. As the crowd lingered, sharing coffee and memories, Jacob stepped outside, the winter air sharp. The stars above Willow Creek were bright, and he felt Edward and Clara there, their love no longer locked away. The workshop's lights glowed behind him, a promise kept, a story told. Jacob knew this was just the beginning, more stories would come, more lives would connect. He'd found his purpose, not in blueprints but in the heart of a love that had shaped his family, his town, his life. Jacob Ellis stood in the transformed workshop, now a glowing heart of Willow Creek, its walls adorned with stories of love and loss. The oak display case at the center held Edward and Clara's silver rings, their "See Annie Forever" engravings catching the soft light of the skylights. Clara's letters, Edward's final note, and a carved wooden bird from their wartime days rested beside them, each a piece of a love that had endured a bombing, decades of silence, and the weight of unspoken grief. Since the workshop's opening a month ago, it had become more than Jacob intended, a place where the town came to remember, to share, to heal. For Jacob, it was something deeper. A mirror to his own transformation, a lesson in what mattered most. The winter sun filtered through the workshop's windows, casting a warm glow on the guestbook. Its pages filled with notes from visitors. "For Clara, who saved my uncle," one read. "For Edward, who kept her promise," said another. Jacob traced the words, his fingers lingering on the paper. He'd started this to honor his grandfather and Clara Hensley, but the workshop had given him something unexpected, a sense of belonging. The engineer who once lived for blueprints and deadlines now lived for these stories, for the people who carried them. Edward's toolbox, once a locked mystery, had opened a door to a life Jacob hadn't known he needed. He thought of Lila Hensley, now a friend, who'd brought Clara's spirit into the project. Lila visited often, tending a small rose garden outside the workshop, a nod to Clara's love of flowers. She'd become a partner in this work, her laughter filling the space as they planned events, veterans' talks, history lessons for schoolchildren, a spring exhibit for more wartime stories. Lila's presence grounded Jacob, her stories of Clara weaving a thread between past and present. "You've given her a voice," Lila told him one afternoon, her eyes bright. She'd be proud. Jacob smiled, but the words settled deep, a reminder of why he'd started, why he couldn't stop. Margaret, his grandmother, had visited the workshop a week after the opening, her wheelchair guided by a nurse. She paused by the display, her hand trembling as she touched the glass above Clara's ring. "Edward's heart was big enough for us all," she said, her voice soft but certain. Jacob had knelt beside her, his heart full. "You made this possible, Grandma," he said. "You told me to honor them." Margaret's eyes, clouded by age but sharp with love, met his. "You honored us too," she said. "This is family, Jacob, messy, broken, beautiful." Her words were a gift, a blessing that freed him from the fear he'd hurt her by uncovering Clara. Margaret's grace, her acceptance of Edward's past, taught Jacob that love wasn't a competition but a tapestry, woven from every thread of a life. Inspired by Margaret and Lila, Jacob began writing a booklet about Edward and Clara, not for profit but for memory. He worked late into the night, his apartment lit by a single lamp, the clack of his keyboard a rhythm of purpose. The booklet was simple: Clara's wartime letters, Edward's final note, and a narrative of their love, their loss, their legacy. Jacob included Lila's memories, Margaret's reflections, and stories from townsfolk who'd known them. He wrote of the rings, forged in war, carried through silence, now reunited in the workshop. The act of writing was healing, a way to process his grief for Edward, his awe for Clara, his gratitude for Margaret. It was also a confession: Jacob had been solitary. His life a series of projects, not connections. The workshop, the booklet, the people, they changed him. He shared a draft with Lila, who read it in her flower shop, surrounded by roses. "It's perfect," she said, tears in her eyes. "It's not just their story, it's yours, too." Jacob nodded, realizing she was right. The booklet wasn't just about Edward and Clara. It was about a grandson learning to live, to love, to carry forward what they'd left behind. He printed 50 copies at the local press, their covers embossed with an oak leaf, a nod to the tree where Edward and Clara had carved their initials. He gave the first to Margaret, who held it like a treasure. "You're telling the truth," she said, "and that's what lasts." The workshop thrived, its doors open most days. School children came on field trips, their laughter echoing as they tried carving with Edward's old tools. Veterans shared stories at monthly meetings, their voices thick with memory. Mrs. Carter, the librarian, started a history club, using the workshop as a base. Jacob watched it all, his heart swelling. He'd once thought Edward's legacy was the birdhouses he'd carved, the lessons he'd taught. Now he saw it was bigger, a love that had shaped a family, a town, a grandson. The workshop was proof that truth, even when painful, could heal, could connect, could endure. One evening, Jacob sat alone in the workshop, the guest book open, the display case glowing. He thought of his old life, solitary, ordered, safe. He'd built bridges for clients, but never for himself. The ring, the letters, the toolbox, they'd forced him to cross into unknown territory. To face Edward's pain, Clara's sacrifice, Margaret's grace. He'd learned that love wasn't just romance but showing up, staying, telling the truth even when it hurt. The message was clear. Uncovering the past, no matter how hard, could build something new, something lasting. It was a lesson Jacob wanted to carry, to share, to live. He walked to the display, his fingers brushing the glass above the rings. "Thank you," he whispered, to Edward, to Clara, to the love that had brought him here. The workshop was quiet, but it felt alive, its walls holding every story told, every tear shed. Jacob knew he'd keep it going, not just for them but for himself, for the town, for the future. He was no longer just an engineer. He was a storyteller, a keeper of memories, a man who'd found his place. Outside, the winter stars shone over Willow Creek, their light a reminder of the night Edward and Clara had sat under an oak, promising forever. Jacob stepped into the cold, locking the workshop door, the key no longer a secret but a symbol. He'd return tomorrow, and the next day. Each visit a commitment to the values he'd learned: truth, connection, love. The booklet, now in homes across town, was his way of sharing that, of ensuring Edward and Clara's story lived on. Not as a tragedy but as a light. Jacob Ellis stood in the heart of the Willow Creek Workshop, now a vibrant community hub, its walls alive with the echoes of a year's worth of stories. The oak display case at the center glowed under soft lights, holding Edward and Clara's silver rings, their Siani forever engravings, a testament to a love that had survived war, silence, and time. Clara's letters, Edward's final note, and a carved wooden bird from their wartime days rested beside them, drawing visitors, veterans, schoolchildren, families, who left notes in the guest book. Their words weaving a tapestry of memory. A year after opening the workshop, Jacob felt its pulse, a rhythm that had changed him from a solitary engineer to a keeper of stories. A man rooted in the town he'd once planned to leave. The December air was crisp, the workshop bustling with preparations for the annual winter fair. Children laughed as they carved ornaments with Edward's old tools, their voices mingling with the hum of conversation from volunteers. Lila Hensley arranged roses by the entrance, her silver hair catching the light, her smile a constant since the workshop became her second home. Margaret, Jacob's grandmother, now 81, visited weekly, her wheelchair a familiar sight. Her stories of Edward a gift to every listener. The workshop wasn't just a tribute to Edward and Clara, it was Willow Creek's heart, a place where the past spoke to the present, where love was a legacy anyone could claim. Jacob's booklet, Siani Forever, A Love Through War, had spread beyond the town, its 50 copies now in libraries, VFW halls, and homes across the county. Readers wrote to Jacob, sharing their own family stories, a lost uncle, a wartime letter, a ring tucked away. The booklet wasn't about fame but about connection. A way to ensure Edward and Clara's love lived on. Jacob had written it to honor them, but it had honored him, too, teaching him that truth, even when painful, could build bridges. He'd mailed a copy to Lila's cousin in Oakville, who'd known Clara as a child, and received a letter back. "You gave my aunt a voice. Thank you." The words stayed with Jacob. A reminder of why he'd opened the toolbox, why he'd followed the ring. Today, the workshop was quiet, the fair preparations paused for a special event. A memorial ceremony at Clara's grave in Oakville, marking the 1-year anniversary of the workshop's opening. Jacob had planned it with Lila, a way to close the circle, to bring Edward and Clara together in spirit. He locked the workshop door, the key no longer a secret but a symbol of trust, and drove to Oakville with Lila and Margaret. The cemetery was as he remembered, its maples bare, the air heavy with winter's promise. Clara's headstone stood simple and proud, Clara Hensley, 1922 to 1975, beloved daughter and sister. Jacob carried a wooden plaque he'd carved, its edges smooth, its surface etched with Siani Forever, a final gift to the woman who'd shaped his grandfather's heart. Lila's family joined them, her cousin, her niece, a few Oakville elders who'd known Clara. Margaret sat wrapped in a quilt, her eyes bright despite the cold. Jacob stood by the grave, the plaque in his hands, his heart full. "We're here for Clara and Edward," he began, his voice steady, carrying over the wind. "Their love didn't end in 1944. It lived in Clara's teaching, in Edward's workshop, in the rings they carried. It lives here, with us." He read a passage from his booklet, Clara's words from her diary. "I see you in every soldier who comes home." The crowd was silent, some wiping tears, others nodding, their own memories stirred. Lila placed a rose on the grave, her hand trembling. "You're not forgotten, Aunt Clara," she whispered. Margaret spoke next, her voice frail but clear. "Edward loved Clara, and he loved me. That's not a contradiction, it's a life. This place, this story, it's what love does, it stays." Jacob's eyes burned, Margaret's wisdom a beacon. The crowd murmured agreement, hands clasping, a shared understanding of love's complexity. Lila's cousin shared a memory of Clara, her laughter in a schoolyard, her quiet strength. Jacob placed the plaque by the headstone, its oak a nod to the tree where Edward and Clara had carved their initials. "For you both," he said, his voice breaking. "Together now." The ceremony ended with a moment of silence, the wind whispering through the maples, the sky a soft gray. Jacob felt Edward and Clara there. Their love no longer locked away but free, carried by every person present. Lila hugged him, her eyes wet. "You did this," she said. "You brought them home." Jacob nodded, too moved to speak. Margaret reached for his hand, her smile a blessing. The families lingered, sharing stories, their voices a soft hum, a community bound by a love that had waited decades to be told. Back in Willow Creek, Jacob returned to the workshop alone, the stars emerging above. The space was dark, but he didn't turn on the lights, letting the glow of the display case guide him. He opened the guest book, its pages a testament to the lives touched. "For my dad, who never came home. For love that lasts." He thought of his old life, solitary, ordered, safe. The ring, the toolbox, the letters, they'd upended it, forcing him to face Edward's grief, Clara's sacrifice, Margaret's grace. They'd shown him that love was an action, a choice to tell the truth, to stay, to connect. The workshop was his promise to keep choosing, to keep the stories alive. He walked to the display, his fingers brushing the glass above the rings. "You're home," he whispered to Edward, to Clara, to the boy he'd been, watching his grandfather carve. The workshop was quiet, but it felt full, its walls holding every laugh, every tear, every story shared. Jacob knew he'd stay. Not just for the workshop but for Willow Creek, for the family he'd found in Lila, Margaret, the town. He was no longer just Edward's grandson, he was a storyteller, a bridge between past and future. A man who'd found his purpose in a locked box. As he stepped outside, the winter air sharp, the stars shone like the night Edward and Clara had sat under an oak, promising forever. Jacob looked up, his breath visible, and felt them there, their love a light that had guided him home. He locked the workshop, the key warm in his hand, and walked into the night. Knowing some locks are meant to be opened, not to break a heart, but to set it free. The story of Grandpa's toolbox was always locked, until I found the wedding ring that wasn't Grandma's offers profound lessons about the enduring power of truth and love. Through Jacob's journey to uncover Edward and Clara's wartime love, we learn that facing the past, even when it's painful, can heal old wounds and forge new connections. Clara's sacrifice, Edward's quiet grief, and Margaret's grace teach us that love is not diminished by its complexities but enriched by honesty and forgiveness. The workshop's transformation into a community hub underscores that sharing stories, our own or those we inherit, builds bridges across generations, reminding us to cherish the legacies hidden in locked boxes and to open them with courage, so love can live on. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us on this heartfelt journey through Grandpa's toolbox was always locked, until I found the wedding ring that wasn't Grandma's. Your support means the world as we share stories that celebrate love, truth, and legacy. If this tale of Jacob, Edward, and Clara touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and connect us across generations. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your feedback in the comments, or tell us about your own family stories that deserve to be unlocked. Together, let's keep these legacies alive. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us on this heartfelt journey. Your support means the world as we share stories that celebrate love, truth, and legacy. If this tale of Jacob, Edward, and Clara touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and connect us across generations. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your feedback in the comments, or tell us about your own family stories that deserve to be unlocked. Together, let's keep these legacies alive.